They speak of the Ottoman Empire with pride, its golden domes, powerful armies, and vast dominions stretching across continents. But behind the magnificence was a truth too dark to ignore. For countless women, conquest meant chains, and life itself became a punishment worse than death. Torn from their families, sold in markets, and reduced to property, they were stripped not only of freedom but of identity and hope. Their pain was hidden behind palace walls, their voices silenced by history. Yet their suffering still echoes, reminding us that empires rise and fall, but human dignity must never be forgotten. The Ottoman Empire is often remembered as one of the most powerful empires in history, admired for its grand architecture, strategic brilliance, and cultural achievements. It stretched across 3 continents, influencing millions of lives and leaving behind a legacy that is still visible today. Yet behind this image of glory and progress was a system built on human suffering, especially for women who became trapped in the machinery of slavery. Female slavery in the empire was not a rare or accidental practice. It was organized, regulated, and deeply tied to the empire's political and economic structure. These women were not treated as individuals with dignity, but as property to be bought, sold, and exploited for labor, pleasure, and dynastic control. The Ottomans didn't just conquer lands, they conquered women's bodies. Their power was displayed not only on the battlefield but also within the hidden systems of exploitation that fed the empire from within. To understand how this machine worked, we must begin with how women were taken. The women who filled the slave markets of the Ottoman Empire came from many directions, taken through war, piracy, and trade. The Balkans were one of the most targeted regions, where Christian families lived under constant fear of raids. Soldiers and raiders swept through villages, capturing young women and children, leaving communities broken. In the Caucasus, especially Georgia and Circassia, women were considered highly valuable because of their appearance and were sold for high prices in Ottoman cities. From Africa, women were transported through long and brutal routes, often forced into domestic and sexual service once they reached Constantinople or other major centers. Jewish women, though fewer in number, were also among those enslaved during conflicts and regional instability. No family was safe, raids turned homes into hunting grounds, and the victims were treated as resources for an empire that saw human beings as part of its wealth. These captives were not simply byproducts of war, but were deliberately sought after, with entire campaigns designed to capture and sell human lives. But once captured, the women's ordeal had only just begun. In Constantinople, the slave markets functioned with strict organization and clear systems of value. The Avrat Pazari, often called the women's market, and the Azur Pazari, the general slave market, became the main centers where human beings were traded. Women were displayed, inspected, and categorized according to their origin, physical appearance, and even their perceived ability to bear children. Those from the Caucasus, particularly Circassian and Georgian women, were considered the most desirable and were sold at the highest prices. African women were often valued less financially, but were still in demand for both household and sexual service. Each woman had a price tag, and her fate depended on what the buyer wanted. Here, human lives had price tags, and the marketplace treated people as nothing more than commodities to be evaluated and exchanged. The transactions were not secretive, but part of a normalized economy that made slavery appear as ordinary business. Yet the most expensive women were not the end product of the system. They were only the raw material for something far worse, as many would be taken into special training designed to reshape them completely. After being purchased, many young women were not taken directly into service, but sent into special training facilities that prepared them for life inside elite households or the imperial harem. These schools were less about education and more about reshaping human beings into tools of obedience. Girls were taught music, singing, and instruments to entertain, languages to communicate with masters and guests, and dance to display grace and allure. More disturbing was the training in sexual performance, where their bodies were conditioned to satisfy the desires of those who owned them. The purpose was clear: erase their old identities, strip away memories of family and culture, and rebuild them into submissive figures who would never question their role. This wasn't education, it was reprogramming, carried out with discipline and strict supervision. Resistance often brought harsh punishment, while quick learners were rewarded with slightly better treatment. Once reshaped through this system of conditioning, they were considered ready to be moved into the most guarded and feared place of all, the Sultan's inner world. The imperial harem is often imagined as a place of luxury, filled with jewels, silks, and pampered women. In reality, it was a place of strict control where every detail of life was regulated. At the bottom were the odalisques, women newly brought in from markets or training schools, who served in basic duties while waiting for the chance to be noticed. Above them were concubines, women who had already caught some attention and were used for the sultan's pleasure or for household tasks. A select few became favorites, gaining influence if they bore children or managed to win the sultan's trust. At the top stood the valide sultan, the sultan's mother, who often held real power in palace politics. Yet this hierarchy did not mean safety. Women were constantly competing against one another, pressured to betray or undermine rivals in order to rise. Behind guarded doors, survival was a daily competition where dignity was secondary to obedience. Every gesture and word was watched, and even a small mistake could destroy a woman's future. And the punishments for failure were brutal. Life inside the harem was built on discipline enforced through constant fear. Women who resisted orders or failed to satisfy expectations were beaten or denied food until they submitted. Starvation was used as a weapon to weaken both body and spirit, reminding captives that their survival depended entirely on obedience. Some concubines simply disappeared, removed quietly when they were no longer wanted or when they posed a threat to palace order. Execution was not unusual, carried out to make examples of those who dared to defy the system. These acts of cruelty served a clear purpose: to prevent solidarity among the women by showing that resistance or unity would be punished with destruction. Disobedience was answered with erasure, ensuring that fear spread faster than loyalty. Yet even for those who obeyed completely, there was no guarantee of safety. A concubine's position depended on the sultan's shifting preferences and palace politics, meaning that obedience itself could not protect them from the dangers that lay ahead. But even obedience offered no true safety. Motherhood in the Ottoman system was both a path to influence and a source of terrible danger. A concubine who bore the sultan a child gained the status of al-Walid, which meant she could no longer be sold and had a stronger position within the palace. For some women, this offered a rare chance to rise above the lowest ranks of slavery. But the reality was far harsher for many others. Pregnancies were often suppressed or secretly ended if the child was not desired, especially when it threatened succession politics or upset palace balance. Infanticide was a grim reality, used to eliminate children considered inconvenient or dangerous to dynastic control. Some children were quietly removed from records, their existence erased, as if they had never lived. The empire even treated certain lineages as more valuable than others, effectively turning reproduction into selective breeding under the guise of dynasty building. Even motherhood, nature's protection, became a weapon of control used by the empire to keep women bound and powerless. The fate of both mother and child rested not on natural bonds, but on the sultan's will. The legal system itself made sure these women stayed trapped. The position of female slaves in the Ottoman Empire was reinforced by law, which treated them primarily as property rather than as individuals. In principle, Islamic law recognized certain protections, but in practice the Ottoman system made clear distinctions between the rights of free women and those enslaved. Free women could appeal to courts for justice and had recognized rights over marriage, inheritance, and dignity. Enslaved women, by contrast, were excluded from these protections. They were legally owned, and their masters had the right to sell, gift, or even dispose of them at will. Sexual access was also legally sanctioned, meaning a master could use his female slaves without consequence, while any violation of a free woman carried serious penalties. This created a two-tier system where one group of women was considered worthy of law's protection while the other was treated as property to be consumed. The law did not protect them, it protected their masters. And it was this legal cover that allowed the empire to industrialize exploitation, turning the suffering of women into a structured and normalized part of its society. The exploitation of female slaves was not only a social or cultural practice, but also a major part of the Ottoman economy. The empire treated the slave trade as a steady revenue stream, with markets generating vast sums from the buying and selling of women. Prices varied by origin and appearance, creating a structured economy that turned human beings into measurable wealth. Beyond the markets, enslaved women were sometimes used as diplomatic gifts or bargaining tools, offered to foreign rulers and allies as symbols of generosity or loyalty. This turned captives into a form of currency, traded as easily as gold or land. The profits gained from this system were significant, helping to fund military campaigns, maintain palaces, and sustain the empire's administrative structure. The empire was built not only on taxes and conquest, but on women's bodies, whose exploitation supported the foundations of Ottoman power. Yet this machinery of suffering was not entirely uncontested. Within its walls, not all women remained silent victims, and some found ways to resist or reshape their fate. Even within a system built on control and fear, some women found ways to resist. Their defiance was often subtle, carried out in forms that would not immediately draw attention. Some sabotaged tasks, spread rumors to damage rivals, or formed hidden alliances that gave them small measures of protection. In rare cases, women used poison or plotted accidents to remove especially cruel masters, though discovery meant certain death. A few, like Harem Sultan and Kozum Sultan, managed to rise from concubinage to positions of great influence, shaping politics and even ruling behind the throne. Their power, however, was the exception, not the rule. Many others who resisted simply vanished, executed, or erased from memory as warnings to those who remained. Even in chains, some women found ways to fight, showing that human dignity could not be fully broken. But these cases were rare. For the majority, survival itself was the only form of resistance left. The system of female slavery in the Ottoman Empire did not disappear quickly. It continued in different forms until the late 19th century, long after many other empires had begun to abolish slavery. The traces of this exploitation remain visible even today. Genetic studies in regions once under Ottoman control reveal patterns that reflect centuries of forced unions and selective reproduction. Cultural traces also linger, with stories, songs, and traditions shaped by the memory of lives lost to captivity. Yet much of this history has been silenced in mainstream accounts, hidden behind the more celebrated image of Ottoman grandeur. The empire may have fallen, but its shadow remains in bloodlines and broken stories, reminding us of the countless women whose suffering was erased from official narratives. The silence surrounding their experiences raises an important challenge. How should we remember these victims, and what responsibilities do we carry once the truth is uncovered? Which leaves us with a question: what do we do with this truth? The story of female slavery under the Ottomans reveals a system of exploitation that was deliberate, organized, and supported by law. It was not a collection of isolated abuses, but a policy that turned women into property for profit, politics, and pleasure. Their lives were stolen, their voices silenced, and their suffering hidden behind the image of imperial greatness. To remember them is to restore some part of their dignity, to acknowledge that history's grandeur was built on their pain. This truth challenges the way we view power and civilization, reminding us that achievements lose meaning when they rest on cruelty. The empire may be gone, but its lessons remain urgent. History's lesson is simple. When human beings are reduced to property, civilization itself is only a facade.